Knives, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the knife that you could possibly be bidding on right now, and also give you some tips and tricks just to kind of help you out in the future with all your fun knife endeavors. So kind of want to start by just going over some basic shapes and just get all of us on the same page. A couple of things here. I borrowed these. This is like the typical knife block that you kind of see come in for sharpening. And I just wanted to go over the sort of do's and don'ts when you're buying a knife and picking one out for yourself. And maybe some of these will work for you and some of these won't. So I'll start here with these two guys. Very similar shapes here. So this is a traditional sort of boning knife and fillet knife. These days, honestly, I would use this over this just because of the profile's a little bit thinner. And here's the other thing about boning knives is unless you are taking apart a half of a pig on a regular basis, or you're hanging a lamb carcass in your garage and breaking that down, or even if you hunt, these are kind of overkill for your everyday stuff. So, you know, boning and deboning at home, I don't know, chicken, maybe like Frenching bones. I can think of a handful of other things, and obviously breaking down some fish that you would need a boning knife for or a fillet knife for. However, like I said, these are industry standard for like breaking down larger pieces of meat. Usually hunters will use a sawzall and a skinning knife, and that's basically it. So yeah, I mean, these, unless you're really into breaking down your own stuff, even if it's just like, let's say, I don't know, a pork shoulder, and you're gonna take out the bone, this is a little overkill. Even for a leg of lamb, this is a little overkill. So typically when I make boning knives or fillet knives, I kind of make them on the smaller side and on the thinner side. So really, I mean, for me, there's no need to have both of these. And they're a little bit big for what you would use at home. This is huge for a chicken, by the way. Both of these are. I actually use paring knives to break down birds. Even larger birds like turkeys and stuff, I will use maybe a knife that's about 2 inches shorter than this. So not my favorite. People use these for everything but what their intended purpose is. Like everyone's house that I go over to that's not in the industry will be cutting a block of cheese with this or an apple or whatever, but you never see anyone using their boning knife for breaking down a very large piece of meat. So moving on to this little guy, which is a lot of people's like favorite go-to shape. It's a weird hybrid of a Santoku meets utility meets petty. I'm not really sure, but I know a lot of people that love small knives because they're just way less intimidating. And especially if you use smaller cutting boards, small knives can be great. And I actually made sort of my own version of this knife that I'll show you guys in a little bit. That's kind of fun. You know, I can't hate on this knife as much as I want to, and I want to make fun of it. I think they're fun, and yeah, I mean, little knives are cool. And like I said, you know, little cutting boards, little knife, you're not creating a whole giant mess. If you're like me though, my butcher block stays out and is part of my kitchen. So I tend to just use big knives because I have all the space that I want. And big knives is a lot less energy. You wouldn't think so, but with the draw of a large blade, you're not constantly going back and forth and moving around. It's just more fluid for me and I get way cleaner cuts. But this is great for like, if you're making a sandwich in a hurry or something like that. So this guy, sort of a utility knife slash petty knife. You might see them called petty knives now. This is just a tiny bit of flex. I mean, to me, there's not a drastic difference in these two knives. You could use this to get that shoulder bone out of a Boston butt or break down a chicken. I mean, this is kind of, I don't know, for me, it's a pretty solid knife. I definitely own a few of these knives. Not this particular brand, but this style of knife. I like them. And it gives me a little more something to sort of grab onto. I feel a little bit better working with a larger knife than I do a smaller knife. And a lot of people also don't really grasp that until you've done both, is the bigger knives, even though they may look more intimidating, they're a lot safer to use. I can give you lots of stories, but I don't want to get into the gory stuff. But it's a lot easier to cut yourself with a small knife and do a lot of damage than it is with a big one. A good sort of way to think about it is the difference in like the way a Ferrari would handle versus a big pickup truck. You're going to be all squirrely and all over the place with a little sports car, but a truck is just going to kind of drive and, be a little more comfortable. Harder to stop, but definitely a smoother, ride. So anyway, going on to the French knife, which this isn't a French knife, but a lot of people call it that, aka chef knife. I'll really quickly get into the difference between this and a French knife. A French knife is way smaller than this, and people kind of use those terms interchangeably, and I'll pull one up in a second, but you can actually see that grind. This is a good knife to use just as like a reference point for people, because when we talk about grinds, that's super important in knives and how they handle, how they perform. This is a really good example of a really bad grind. Essentially, this knife has no taper to it, so this thickness here and this thickness here are the same. That's bad. And you can see this grind only goes down about 1/2 inch all the way to the end of that knife. And this is going to do one good thing, which is aid you in food release. So things aren't going to stick to this knife because they're going to stick to that grind and kind of just fall off as you cut, which is a good thing, but there's almost no taper to this at all. And the actual primary grind into the edge, it's so small that this is a lot like driving an axe through a log in the sense that it's splitting instead of cutting. You kind of want, there is such a thing as too thin, and there is such a thing as too thin of a distal taper. But this, like I said, it's a really good example of a really bad knife. And this whole situation is just super wonky. And even though, this is so uncomfortable for me to try to cut with. My hand wants to sit right in this ridge. My pinch grip's kind of all over the place. It kind of forces my 2 fingers into this weird choil, which I don't like. And also with knives, you see a lot of knives that run almost straight at the edge when you're looking at the heel of the knife, and the handle runs totally like parallel with that, which is not really a good thing. If anything, you kind of want your handle trajectory to come up, or you can have your knife flat, and the way you grind it when it sits on the cutting board is it actually sits at an angle like this. So people talk about knuckle clearance a lot, and they think you need to have this super tall knife for a super big hand, but that's not true at all. And I'll show you an example of that on one of my knives that's actually not tall at all, but it gives you tons of knuckle clearance because of the trajectory of the handle. It doesn't sit like this on the cutting board, it actually sits like this. So you have so much more room. That's a common mistake I see a lot in knife making is people do the second, what am I trying to say? The second dimension is kind of wonky, and that's just a design flaw. If you ever see a handle bow down and this run flush, to me, that's like one of the biggest no-nos ever. That's just my opinion though, but you're just canceling, you're doing like negative knuckle clearance on those knives. And then you have to have this giant tall blade, which I personally think is really uncomfortable. I think the one good thing about this knife though is these little choils on the side here. That's kind of nice. Other than that, I'm just totally ripping on this. Sorry, whoever owns this knife. So anyway, this guy, you see a lot of the vegetable knives being super popular these days. They call them Nikiris. There's also like its earlier cousin from Japan, which is a lot thicker, that they use those knives to cut daikon radishes, to roll them. And nowadays you see the Nikiri a lot more, which is like a double, nowadays a double bevel vegetable knife with a very straight blade. The profile, it just looks like a box essentially. This is pretty close to it. This is a funny knife, and this is actually made in Japan and then was sold in the States maybe like 70s, 80s, probably in the 80s. And it's weird how knife imports have kind of changed. It used to be that Americans considered Japanese knives to be like the cheap imports. Then it kind of went Taiwan and then China. Really, Japanese have always been producing like some of the best quality steel, not because of the steel, it's because of the technique that they use on that steel. If you look at Japan as resource for metal back in the day, it wasn't the best place for mining ore and making the steel. Even nowadays, if you buy the fancy Hitachi blue paper steel, then you're going to make your own sort of Japanese knife out of that stuff. It's iron and carbon, I think, and that's pretty much it. There's another steel with a little bit more in it. The white paper steel you might see, which is more of an alloy, but it's really how they work the steel that makes it so amazing. It's not so much just the steel itself. And I'll talk a little bit about that later when I talk about metal. These knives that are just like straight, and you can see this has some of that trajectory I was talking about. When this sits flat on the cutting board, this handle shoots up. It doesn't do this. So, kudos to them. This knife was a lot longer. I took a lot of this off because it was just in such bad shape. So I shortened it by a couple inches, but I have never been super happy with these knives that just run totally flat. I mean, I fell victim to like buying all the Japanese knives I could when I was in college, and I just thought they were the coolest thing, and I still do, and I still appreciate them, but that's one shape that like it doesn't work well with me, and it doesn't work well with how I cut. So totally flat edge like this. I mean, this has like 2-degree bend or something in it. It's almost nothing. It's just not my cup of tea. So I'll make them if people want them, but it's not something I would make for myself. Now, this is more of a traditional French knife. It's still not a French knife, but this is the closest thing on the table I have to one. A French knife is kind of like if you took a chef knife and a utility/petty and put them together. So it's got kind of a longer blade. Definitely not as long as like your typical nowadays like American chef knife. Even like some of the hybrid knives, like the Japanese American ones, and even the European knives, you're kind of seeing like the trend of bigger is better, which, I do like a pretty big knife, but definitely like not into the super huge stuff. These knives are just easy to use, and they're easy to do a lot with. This knife is not going to do much except plow through big vegetables and hack through chickens, and that's pretty much it. This knife is going to be super good at mushrooms and garlic and shallots and small stuff, as well as still have the capabilities to go through something larger. I'd say that this is probably one of my favorite shapes. This particular knife is one of those like Victorinox Forstner. Yeah. And you can see it's been through the dishwasher a number of times, so it is pretty beat up. But still together and still functions as a knife. And I would say definitely the older ones are better. Just a little hint. If you can pick up, I'd say knives from the 60s, 70s into the 80s, even if you're looking at Sabatiers. I recently found one that was still in the package from Macy's in New York from 1984. I believe it was like the rhinoceros one. Anyway, they're super cool knives and very collectible, and they sort of coined the French knife. Anywho, moving right along to this guy. Serrated knives, bread knives, the knife that sort of gets used for everything when all the other stuff in your block is dull. I have nothing against these, and I use them for bread. This is another Victorinox Forstner, and actually this one is mine. I've had this since culinary school, so I'm almost 40 now, so it's been a while. And this knife's still kicking. It's been resharpened and polished a whole bunch of times, and the handle is definitely separating on this guy. But I still use it, and one of these days I will put a new handle on it. The only thing I don't like about this knife is how flexible that is. That is crazy flexible for a bread knife, for me anyway. But I remember using this to cut cakes and things, and that super thin, third dimension on this is nice. to get through stuff like that. Yeah, so I'm working on serrated knives. I haven't got to that point yet where I'm comfortable selling them, but I am on it because, there's definitely a market for them, and they are great for bread. However, I will say, if your chef knife is sharp enough, right through it. Crusty bread, not so much, and it's dangerous to cut crusty bread with a sharp, straight knife. So you definitely want the serrations. If you're a fan of like the real good sourdoughs and the good French breads and anything that's really crusty and hard on the outside, really sharp knives can slip on that and go right into your finger, and you don't want that. So, moving along, you see these a lot. People call them bird's beak knives. This is a tournay knife, and this is actually made to cut a very specific cut that is a 7-sided sort of oblong football-shaped object. So you see like potatoes and carrots and root vegetables all sort of carved into this 7-sided football. Really cool, old school thing to do, and the reason for the 7 sides was to represent the 7 original provinces of France, and I'm surprised that I still remember that, but they used to make us do that a lot in school. You'd cut towards yourself and turn. You can also flute mushrooms with these and do a handful of other tricks. People always like to say that they use these to peel things. Don't. Use a peeler. You're just going to waste a lot of food if you use a knife to peel all your food. Maybe your grandma did, but we have really good peelers nowadays, and they waste a lot less food. And go for it. I mean, if you really want to peel carrots with one of these, go for it. The odds of you getting cut, pretty good. So, tournay knife. I own one of these just because I think I use this for deveining shrimp and shelling shrimp more than anything, so that's probably why I still have this guy. So yeah, I mean, there's better, safer ways to devein shrimp anywho, but it's a cool knife, and hey, I'm not knocking like buying a bunch of knives because I'm not one to talk. You should see my collection. Is kind of ridiculous, and I've recently thinned it out so that I could buy more expensive knives. Quality over quantity. Anywho, I'll move along into Damascus, or pattern welded steel, or forge welded steel. It kind of goes by a lot of names. Saying Damascus, though, is like saying Parmesan, or saying, Champagne or Dijon. It's really describing a place. And unless that product comes from that place, it's not really of that name. So like champagne, for example, you can make sparkling wine similar to champagne in Missouri, but you shouldn't call it champagne. And that's why, like, what is it? The AOC exists so that people aren't just like ripping names in France and sort of slapping them on labels, with wine anyway. And with all food, I think Kraft got in trouble a while ago for using Dijon. Anyway. So, Damascus, real Damascus, or Wootz Damascus, if you Google Damascus, you can kind of look at the history. The steel that you see today that's called Damascus is really nothing like that. And that steel wasn't purposely layered to get a pattern. It was actually how they made the steel from the ore, from a very specific mine they think is, I think, right outside of Jordan. That had this tiny, tiny fraction of a percent of vanadium, and the way that they made this steel, which is now sort of the art of that's been lost, but they're figuring it out, or they may have actually. I think somebody came super close recently to making like authentic Wootz. You can Google it. There's a great, really long video about sort of the search to make Wootz Damascus again. But the pattern that came out in that blade wasn't manipulated or forced to be that specific pattern. It was just sort of the mark of getting that steel right. With all the ingredients and techniques of making it, you had this, mythically sharp, crazy steel that, was cut silk. It was just amazing. What we do today is stack steel. So 2 different pieces of metal chopped up and just one on top of the other, and alternate them until you get a nice fat stack of alternating metal. In a lot of cases, we'll use Like this guy right here is 1095 and 15N20. That started off as a giant piece, and that's just a chunk of it that I've been flattening out. But once you have this sort of stack, think of like a candy bar in layers, you weld it shut, and that goes into the forge, and it gets smushied into this. So all those layers that you start with get compressed down, and expand out, and then you can chop that up and restack it and repeat that process over and over again. The different patterns you see in the steel is something that you can manipulate and control yourself. So like, whether you use a drill press to come down and make these perfectly sort of, puddled round marks they call raindrop Damascus, or we can cut lines in it and then flatten that back out, and that sort of gives you what's called a ladder pattern. Or you can twist the billet and flatten that back out. There's a lot that you can do. And then you can even go into mosaic Damascus, which is a whole nother animal. But in the end, you end up with something like this, which this is just a cleaned up etched piece of Damascus. And then moving along to a lot more modern technology. This is a piece of the Damascus, which is the knife that you guys can bid on right now. I'll just give you like a tiny bit of history on Damascus, but definitely look them up. They have some fantastic videos on the facility there in Sweden, and videos on making the Damascus. And this is actually internationally patented, which is a very difficult thing to get. And they do a powdered stainless Damascus, which is what they're famous for. This stuff is probably the best quality Damascus I've ever used. I've never ran into anything ever since I've started making knives that has zero inclusions and zero problems and grinds that easily, yet becomes such a hard, tough knife at the end, and is also stainless. A lot of Damascus, especially Damascus I make, is all carbon, so it's not stainless. This is. And the knife that you guys are looking at right now was actually part of the Damascus Chef's Invitational, and that knife was actually in that show, which is really cool. That was so far the highlight of my career, was getting invited to participate in that. They say it is some of the best knife makers in the world for kitchen knives, so I was super honored and still am kind of like in shock that I was able to do that. So yeah, it was super cool for me. It was a great experience. I did a whole series of 7 knives. I have one of them in front of me, and you guys have the other one in front of you. All the rest have been sold. The whole series was based on sort of like a supernatural theme. So I sort of did different natural elements as ghosts, and used different materials to sort of tell a story in these knives. 2 of the 7 were based off dead trees. There was a big dead tree and a little dead tree, which the little dead tree is that paring knife. And if you look, you'll see that it's a very like sort of organic feeling knife as far as like colors and textures, but that is all man-made material. At the very core of that though, it did start in nature somewhat. I think pretty much that entire knife is actually made from cloth, obviously, except for the Damascus itself. The process of making that cloth into a hard object that you could use for a knife handle in the case, which is the saya, the pin, everything, that entire build was fiberglass and cotton, so linen and canvas. It's actually phenolically treated, so they take layers of cloth and epoxy and press it together. And same with fiberglass. That's how they come up with the G10, which you see a lot in the knife making world. So that knife is G10 and linen micarta and canvas micarta. Probably one of the coolest little knives I've ever made. And that knife, to me, a lot of people think paring knife and they think, you cut strawberries with it, or tiny pieces of fruit, maybe garlic. I actually use mine more as a boning knife. And that knife specifically is made to sort of cross over between field dressing knife, perfect knife for deboning chickens and ducks, and also a great knife to just grab if you're going to cut the little stuff like a strawberry, tiny shallots from the garden, garlic, stuff like that. So that was like a really cool knife. I love that knife. This is sort of my take on a big chef knife, sort of like the American style chef knife. And this definitely has like a Japanese flair to it. This Seiya right here is called fat carbon is the material. It's from Lithuania, and it's basically like a Damascus version of carbon fiber with brass, and is layered with the phenolic G10. And there we go. The handle on this guy is also cross-cut carbon from Sweden, and it has an exposed core, and this knife was called the Lost Helm. This is like pretty much one of the best knives I've ever made. Love it. But you can see it is pretty slim compared to a lot of the chef knives you see. It's not giant, but it does cover a lot of ground. And it is really smooth to operate. But you can see when this rests flat, that handle does not rest flat. It shoots up and gives you a ton of knuckle clearance on this. And I have like relatively big hands, and I have more than enough room when I'm actually cutting on the cutting board with this. So don't fall for that, thinking you have to have some big, tall knife if you have big hands. You really don't. You just need the right trajectory on the knife, which is something I wish more people would think out, because it's crazy how many super nice knives I see that like miss that one detail, and it kind of makes that knife like only work for some people, which, you know, is what it is. Moving along, this little guy right here, this is sort of my answer to the catch-all. So sort of a petty, sort of a utility. This has a very nice little distal taper at the end, so you could get a bone or two out with it. But this is just my sort of go-to shape for all around sandwich making, doing whatever when I don't want to get the big knife out. And a couple other, like, this was sort of my answer to the little tiny knife for fun. I thought this would be cool to, like, yeah, I don't know, give this to a little kid and teach them how to cut, or, you know, somebody with really tiny hands that loves the small knives. So I kind of like have fun with it, and I, you know, obviously am influenced by all the knives that come in for sharpening and all the knives that I own. So, you know, there's a knife for everybody. Going into just some quick maintenance for you guys. These are the stones that I like to use. They're Japanese water stones. These are sort of the splash and go stones. They don't have to be soaked. They're expensive. They break easy. I have been sharpening on whetstones for, geez, like 20 years. That's a long time. And I still have really bad days, and I still mess up. So yeah, I mean, there's an art to it, and it's not foolproof, and I'm not going to bore you with here's how I sharpen over and over again. But if you do want to learn, I always teach one-on-one classes for sharpening. Just get a hold of me, and you can come in, and I will show you as much as you want to know about whetstone techniques. I probably in the last, I'd say, few years just got to the point where I can sharpen with my left hand as good as my right hand. And I actually use both hands now when I sharpen, so I switch hands, which is something you have to do when you make knives. You have to sort of become ambidextrous. And sharpening on stones for so long with just my right hand on the handle, flipping the knife, I could tell that I was never hitting both sides perfectly. So if there's one piece of advice I can give you, it's use both of your hands and get really good with your left hand and spend the time to do that, because in the end, it's going to make your knife sharpening so much faster and more efficient, and you're going to spend less time on the stones, and under a microscope, you're going to have pretty even bevels. Whereas I've noticed with people that just use one hand, there's always like a slight difference on the bevels, if you can see it. The other thing I did want to show you guys is just dropping is probably my favorite technique to keep my knives sharp, and that's just using a big fat piece of leather. There's the tan side and the split side. Tan side is the nice side, so if we were making a jacket, this would be on the outside. The split side is the coarse side, and I actually use a diamond paste that I rub into this leather, and it sits and cradles itself in those grains, and it's just very simple backstroking. So instead of like having to go forwards and backwards and constantly be, you know, riding the edge on something that's pretty hard and has the ability to damage your knife, or your knife can damage the stone, This is pretty easy, and it's a lot like you see the old barbers using strops, but just a little bit of time every day that I use my knives, I don't really have to sharpen them that often. And I think my personal kitchen knives at home, I touch up all the time, but I haven't had to put a new edge on them in like 3 years. I finally did the other day because I felt like I needed it. It does get to a point where you do need a fresh edge once in a while, but if you constantly are maintaining your edge, they sort of just get sharper and sharper and sharper until you develop little chips and things, and that's kind of when it's time to like reset everything. Every time you put a fresh edge on a knife too, you are putting you're putting a little more meat behind that edge, and so the knife will slowly over time not have that like blazing sharp, very clean cutting ability when you first got it, but that's just the nature of knives. So the more that you can take care of the edge that's on there instead of constantly putting a new one on, the better off you are. I also have this out, just want to clear a few things up. These steels are not knife sharpeners. They don't sharpen anything at all. This one, maybe like you could argue it sharpens a tiny bit because it does have some pores because it's ceramic. It will remove the tiniest bit of metal. The steel ones, they don't remove that much metal. They kind of just straighten out your blade. And that's more for knives that are softer steel. So a lot of the German knives are very soft. And it's nice because you're not chipping away microscopic pieces of steel. You are sort of just moving them around. And when your knife is dull, it doesn't mean the edge is gone. It just means it's all not straight. It's all wonky, or it's curved all to the right. And, truing it up essentially with these is what you're doing, is straightening steel out. But if you hit a knife too many times on this, it's gonna do more damage to the blade and the edge, I think, than anything. So I'm not a big fan of these at all. This one I like though because it's ceramic and it's super smooth. This doesn't do a lot of damage to your knives, but it doesn't really work with every knife either. It depends on the temper of the knife. The cool thing about the ceramic though is that it's super, super hard. It's also fragile. And with knife steel, it's kind of the same way. The harder the knife is, the more brittle it is and the easier it'll chip. So it's always been sort of a delicate relationship between, hard and soft to get sort of the right edge for the right person. It also matters on like what you're cutting on too. The surface drastically matters. So plastic cutting boards, I'm not a fan of at all. And I personally only like certain woods for my wood cutting boards. If you have any questions about that stuff, feel free to get in touch with me. Lastly, if that's a word, I had this sponge out to remind you about dishwashers and knives. Dishwashers are bad for knives. And yeah, you might be thinking, I know the handles get dry and cracked and whatever, but it's not even about the handle. Because when you see knives advertised like, this is totally dishwasher friendly, that is a complete bunch of BS. It's not about the handle. And yeah, you can make handles that are dishwasher safe. You can't make blades that are dishwasher safe though. And what I mean by that is when we harden knives with some of these knives, especially like the Damascus steel, I'm going over 2000 degrees with that knife and then I'm quenching it. So I'm cooling it quickly and evenly. I do an aluminum plate quench and then I go into water. So that's going from 2000 plus degrees to room temperature in under 2 minutes. That's a drastic change and puts a lot of stress on that metal, but it also is what hardens the steel. So Damascus steel itself was really soft and easy to work with when it's not hardened. When it's hardened, it is crazy hard. So it's also all steel, very brittle when it's hard. And in order to get a knife that's not going to break, that we can have some nice flexibility with and toughness, they say, we have to temper it. So then we cook it again, similar to a temperature you bake cookies at, so like 350 degrees, right? But let's think about baking cookies at 350 degrees for a second. When you have your oven on at 350 and it's preheated and you open it up, you can stick your whole arm in that oven and wave it around. The air in there is 350 degrees, but it's not melting your hand off. In fact, it feels warm for a minute, It's not a big deal. As long as you're not touching the side of the oven or the pan that's in the oven, your hand in 350 degree air is fine for a short amount of time. However, let's think about water for a second. Forget 350, boiling water, so just over 200 degrees. Stick your hand in that for a second. It's gonna be a whole lot different, and you're gonna have a real bad day. So water carries heat a lot differently than air does. And a dishwasher is just steam, and it's compressed. You know, it's trapped, there's pressure. It's like over 190 degrees. And you're putting the steel in there that's been tempered, you know, at an air temperature of 350 degrees into that water bath that's just destroying the metallurgy of the knife. So when you hear people say stuff like, oh, I bought this great set of knives and it cuts so well for like the first 6 months, and then all of a sudden they just don't hold an edge anymore. Well, that's because they went in the dishwasher like 100 times. And over the course of a few years, that knife, just the metal itself gets so soft that it's really easy to sharpen, and the edge lasts for like one onion. At that point, there's really nothing you can do to bring those back, so they're trash. If that's you, then call me and we'll get you some knives. Anyway, that about wraps it up, I think. If you have any questions, feel free to get a hold of me. If you want to learn how to sharpen, call me and we'll work it out. Thank you guys so much. Happy bidding. Enjoy.